Morning.
Hello.
Morning.
Evening.
Good evening.
Afternoon.
Afternoon. Perfect. That's a whole variety of things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, it's 7 p.m. now. Just clicked over. So the sun's not quite gone down. We're only 25 degrees north, so the day doesn't vary that much. Yeah.
And it's got to be kind of early in the morning in Hawaii too, right?
We get 13 and a half hours in the summer.
Aloha, yeah, 5 a.m.
Wow.
Which is just enough to confuse all my Singapore friends.
Yeah.
Because they're only 3 degrees north.
We are getting, we're getting I think we're still getting 16 hours of daylight. And I always think, I'm always so sort of proud of myself that we're, that northern Minnesota, I'm 100 miles from the Canadian border. And of course, there's a whole nation north of me, but sort of don't consider them that much because all the Canadians live within 100 miles of the, almost all of them, 80, 90% of them of the US border. But then, London is at 51 degrees. It's ridiculous. What does that say? What, 21 hours?
No, 21 degrees.
Oh.
Sunrise at 5:23 and sunset at 21:11.
Yeah.
So,
that's crazy. Yeah. So good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everybody. I am back at home, which is nice. I'm enjoying, being here where the loudest noises are birds and crickets, and one of my dogs barking outside. The other one is being quiet and laying under my desk. So
it's usually the cats making the noise.
Yeah, the cats are on either side. They're on windowsills right now, and they are they've been a little bit crazy this morning. So hopefully they'll just calm down now and let me do my thing. I came in and they had there's a bunch of foam rubber on the floor on the other side. I was gone for a week, and my wife came in and fed them and talked to them occasionally and stuff. But they found a microphone and they chewed the foam covering off it. so I guess that'll teach me. In any case, Pat, hi, I'm glad you're here. I did sort of lose track of us talking, so I'll connect back up with you on email, and maybe we can talk about the brain, because I have been using it as kind of an index. I haven't sort of committed to, actually, there we go, knocking over things. I haven't committed to using it as a storage device yet. But I have been using it to index where my cards are that I'm writing. So I've written a bunch as I was working on this little project. I wrote a whole pile of cards, and and now I am indexing them and doing all that stuff. So excuse me. So that's been kind of an interesting process.
Hey, Chris, are you finding it?
I'm finding it works. It worked great. I got through. I had nothing to do, of course, while aside from this one little writing project that I brought for myself. So I finished. I've been promising for quite a long time now. I've been promising people that I work with and people in my university system that I would update this little writing handbook that I had adapted from my father's one that he had written at University of California at Davis. So I wanted, and his had been something that they had printed at the copy center on 8.5 by 11 sheets and sort of bound it inexpensively and sold to students for, $1.50 or $2 kind of thing. And so I expanded it a little bit and made, and added some examples that were from social sciences and history to the, the humanities and the literature ones that he had used. And he had actually sort of Xeroxed student writing, pages of student writing with his, his markings on them, because he used all those old-fashioned editor tools. And so that was oh, what's going on here? Oh, Genevieve, yeah, disappeared. So where'd he go? Anyway, so in any case, I've been meaning to add a piece on making notes, right? Because that's the thing that seems to be, sort of missing for my students. I've been using this thing as a, okay, it's time to write a term paper. Here are some, here's some things to watch out for. Here's some ways to write an outline and things like that. And so the next thing was kind of to add in the note-taking stuff. And I do have to say that my sort of the last couple of weeks that I've had with thinking about paper versus digital, and sort of what are the advantages and flaws of each, I have, maybe this will be a time capsule, because I have sort of leaned a little bit into this idea of kind of not requiring my students to do cards, but some type of deliberate manual process of linking notes together, and not expecting the an application and some type of automation to do it for them. So that's something that I'm, and I'm about ready to pull the trigger on that. This afternoon, I'm going to kind of go through it one more time. I took some photos with my phone of notes that I was using, and I'm going to scan them a little bit better and put some decent images, some better images in there. Add a couple more descriptions, and then I think it's ready to kind of pull the trigger on, which is good, because I had sort of promised it for the 1st of July, so I'm a little bit ahead of schedule. So this week was very useful for that, and then I can kind of turn towards preparing for the new semester. So in any case, that's what I've been up to. Pat, one of the things I wanted to ask you before I went off on this little tangent was the colors. You used a lot of colors in your highlights in like the chapter 10 note. Can you tell me a little bit about why and what? Is it random, or do the different things mean, the different colors mean different things? Is that part of your organization?
Well, I think in general, red is the most important. And other than that, no particular meaning. I think green is more serene, but and yellow is kind of standard, yellow or orange. This is from a plugin named Highlighter, which currently is only partially functional. It stopped working as it was designed a couple of weeks ago. And I've put a notice, and the author is aware of it on GitHub, but so far hasn't corrected it, and I'm not sure. But I found a workaround by setting the hotkeys for some of the highlights. It will still work, although it doesn't work the way it was supposed to work. And unhighlighting is a little bit more of a trouble, but I've posted on GitHub what I found, and other people are finding the same thing. So I'm hoping it will be fully functional, because it's a very nice plugin.
Yeah.
What's it called?
Highlighter.
HIGHLIGHTR.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking of that might sort of fit in sort of with what I'm thinking of using Obsidian for kind of going forward, which will be maybe more of a place where I process, because I think the advantage to me of Obsidian was, that Readwise would sweep my Kindle highlights in there and my Obsidian highlights and all of that. And then I could kind of, crunch away at them. And that was working. It was just that I wasn't really getting to that sort of final place of, actually, writing a note and connecting it to other thoughts and sort of shifting from, okay, I'm collecting, and now I want to kind of turn around and begin the output side. And that was the thing that sort of been, I guess, this summer this has been the challenge for me. This has been the thing that I've sort of been focusing on. So how do you? Yeah. So I haven't used Logsec at all. Can you explain, Torin, what it does for you and how you use it?
Well, it's basically an outliner which has become very popular in the productivity community, and it's open source, cross-platform, and in heavy development. Mm-hmm. So new features being added all the time, and it's got plugins and extensions and whatnot. And it basically just it's a bit kind of works a bit like how Roam does, where you got the main day page, and then you got individual pages, and so I use it for things like fleeting thoughts and my initial note taking, and so I could be a bit more messier, which is so that's how I think, really. Think messily. And then when it comes to formalizing it, should I say, but do that in Obsidian. So that's how I work the two together. So it's the like Obsidian Logseek is local first, so it's saved on your machine rather than in the cloud. No.
Okay.
I've tried using Logseek as an input too. I think it has some advantages in its fluidity, but the thing I don't like about it is it forces you to use a daily note. And anytime you open it, it automatically opens a daily note, and you're supposed to record your thoughts there. I don't really like that structure. And I've integrated Logseek into Obsidian so that the Logseek file folder becomes just a folder in Obsidian, so they're both integrated. But I haven't found it all that much attractive, although, as Tor says, it's more like Rome than Obsidian is.
Okay. Yeah.
It's basically an outliner tool, most primarily, but people use it for note taking and things like that. So, and people write whole scripts and articles and things in it as well, and things like that. So,
yeah, ostensibly.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, ostensibly, it's just another tool that's that could use the same data set because it's based on text. So almost all of these tools, there's one or two, some of the older ones like Evernote and OneNote, sorry, aren't as compatible. But a lot of these new tools are kind of text or markdown as the base. And that becomes a easy standard that can be supported across multiple things. So whether you want to use Roam or you want to use Logseq or Obsidian, and then they all have slightly different features within or different plugin sets. So I've been for the last couple of weeks. It has a tentative name of Friends of the Link, but there's a group of 4 or 5 developers and thinkers who are trying to, they'd like to standardize what we're doing and how we're doing it so that regardless of the tool you choose at the end of the day, you can use the same local data store to plug it into different tools to provide different sets of functionality.
Mhm.
The problem is, I think LogSec has a slightly higher technical hurdle of where are you putting your things and how are you putting them, or what's your capability level for programming and doing advanced things like advanced Boolean operator search is an example.
Yeah.
But if anyone's super interested in that, or you're more on the programmery side, there's some interesting people who are looking at some of that space, and trying to figure out how to make things play together a little better.
Right.
Tools on Tech is one channel which does that sort of thing. And though I've used Logseek for about a year now, and I've not had to use anything like Boolean and things like that, so I haven't really needed to. So,
it's kind of it sounds, what I'm hearing sounds to me like it's sort of, begging the question, okay, what, I've got this, maybe I have this data set, maybe I have this set of notes that is, this folder of different notes that's, that I could open in, X, Y, or Z. What would be the advantage of, Logseq or Logseek or, or Roam or, or something else. And, and is that, that it might be interesting to see if there are, if all of these different apps that are sort of elbowing, for their space in the ecosystem, kind of decide, okay, this is what I do, right? I do Boolean operations on, data, or this is what I do. I do, narrative, blocks and linking. I mean, that was one of the reasons actually that I kind of moved from Roam to Obsidian was, the block size, right? I didn't want every, I wanted a page, a page long block, which Roam, wasn't really kind of affording me. And that was I think that was an advantage for what I was doing for a while. And then, but then I would, then it's, Obsidian has been a place where I write, 500 to 2,000 word sort of essays. And that's not necessarily this, right? And so, so that has been, time blocking is a good.
It's one of the things I've seen too. One of the participants in the group is Jerry Mikulski, who's been using the brain for almost 25 years.
He's the big brain guy. Yeah.
And he's, got this huge graph, and it's fascinating to watch him use it. And there's a simple it's a visual drag and drop. I'm going to link this idea to this other idea. And it's dead easy and simple. And watching him do it live is fascinating. But he's able to do things in seconds that Obsidian would take 4 or 5 minutes. And to do that at scale and in real time while you're on a call is just insane. I've tried to do it in Cant, and the closest thing that it's coming into existence, Zolt has this thing. He's using Excalibur in Obsidian, and he's created a thing called Excalibrain because he was a long time user of the brain, or I think like a decade. So he's starting to build in that functionality that the brain has into Obsidian, but it's not all there yet, but it's amazing what he's already built thus far. It's a little quirky, and depending on what your notes look like when you start into it, you may need to kind of backpedal a little to rethink about what you're doing and how. But I love that visual layout and kind of the visual speed of saying, I'm gonna, even if you don't have notes or what we might consider empty notes in Obsidian, just having an empty note and linking it to another empty note so that you've got these topics that are kind of visually linked, and then you can go back later and fill them in, is fascinating to me. But that's that kind of basic, here's a functionality one tool offers that nothing else does, and it's incredibly good at it, but you need to have some kind of underlying standard layers of what's going on to make that even possible. And that's the problem with a lot of these things. So, Rome is fully closed, and they provide an API, which is probably the worst of all the corporate structures in terms of openness. And then Obsidian's code base is broadly closed, but it's generally an open tool, and you can take your data and do with it whatever you want with it. And then LogSec is at the far end of, we're totally open source, although they're also taking VC money, which is potentially got issues further down the road too. So it's kind of, where do you find a commonality in all these things that a tool gives you something that something else doesn't do, but is able to do it really, really, really well? And not, as an example, the highlighter thing that you mentioned, Pat was using, the first thing I did was look at it to see what is it actually doing, and does that make it incompatible with everything else, so that if I'm using it in Obsidian and Obsidian has a horrible accident and I need to move somewhere else, what does that do to my set of notes, and will it work somewhere else? And the nice part is it's just using a simple HTML markup. So ostensibly, it's not doing anything weird that if I move somewhere else, it's going to ruin the whole enterprise. If that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah, and that does. I think all of this sort of goes, for me to this place where, as I was thinking about, because I sort of felt a little bit emotionally invested in Obsidian. I sort of felt like, well, am I doing these things in Obsidian because, that's what I really want to do? Or am I doing these things in Obsidian because these are things that Obsidian likes to do and does well, right? Like one of the other big reasons that I moved from Rome to Obsidian was because of the quality of the visual of the graph, right? Because I never figured out how to make the Rome graph look like anything that I wanted to try to use or understand. But to go back to we sort of scrolled past. I'm watching the chat log scroll by, and Alaman, your question about time blocking. Anybody got any experience with that? I've used Time, the TYME app, to track, but I haven't really done a good job of planning my time.
I've used it a couple times to be productive when I had limited time, or actually too much time but needed to get something done. But it's like you got to get your head around the idea that you're going to mark out this 1 hour to do the thing, and that's all. And if you can really make yourself believe that, then the time block really works.
Yeah.
If instead you can't, and you're like, I don't feel like doing that right now, then
I've sort of always kind of shied away from apps that really lean into the focus mode, right? We're going to make everything else disappear, and you're right. Like somebody recommended Ulysses, right? And so I looked at Ulysses the other day as a writing app, and and I looked at it and it's like, well, they're so interested in this kind of focus mode thing that I think other people have as well, but I thought, I can focus. That's not my problem, right? It's like a feature looking for an application. Blocking time, I think happens for me in other ways, right? Like I know when my classes are and my office hours are during the day, right? And so those are kind of the big blocks that I work around anyway. And then yeah, and I do like knowing how much time I've spent on things, and I do like kind of that retrospective view. But maybe that's not really kind of what you're thinking about, what you're interested in.
I use it as a way to insert artificial deadlines, and if I could commit to the deadline, then I could use it. If I couldn't convince myself, then
yeah,
it didn't matter that I blocked out that time.
I could never convince myself to use like a Pomodoro timer.
I can do that for actually Pomodoro works well when I have set myself too large of a task. I'm like, I'm just going to work on it for 10 minutes and set the actual timer runs. One works pretty well.
Cool. Yeah, I think maybe that's really kind of what that is about, really sort of functionally, right? Is taking oh, nice. Oh, that one, I've seen that one. Yeah. Don't kill the tree. So there's a disincentive. You burn down the forest. But maybe that's the thing. Maybe it's like what David Allen says about you can't actually work on a project. All you can work on is a task that's related to a project, right? So breaking things down into tasks, maybe is kind of what that is really about.
So this cognitive exercise you're playing, Dan, remember when you're writing your thing on notes for students, this is the exact question they're asking about notes that you're asking about. Is time blocking worth it, right, and useful, and why? And it helps that someone has got the experience to say, this is how I do it and this is why it works for me. And then you can figure that out for yourself. Because I remember, and I think as a culture, we're horrible at doing this, because I remember in 6th grade, somebody saying, oh, you should be taking notes on index cards, and then you can use that kind of as an outline. But that was nowhere near enough motivation for me to want to do that practice, which now I regret, and I wish I had been doing since 6th grade, and could have found a lot of value in. But the motivating factor for why are you doing this? What's the long-term goal? What is that potential output and value of it has totally been lost. And it was kind of underlined because this week I read Appendix C of Beatrice Webb's book, My Apprenticeship, from 1926. So here's a well-known and very well-established sociologist. And I was shocked I'd never heard of her, but I think it's the fact that she's a woman that is the cause of that. But she was one of the co-founders of the London School of Economics.
Right. She
co-founded the New Statesman in 1913, and it's still around as a newspaper today, or magazine. And she's got this huge list of things, but so I find her because I'm looking at notes, and she starts out saying it's really hard to explain even to a college student the stupid value of having good notes. And they just it's hard to do it. And so I can only say there's this kind of, she doesn't use the word magic, but she talks about it the way we do, knowing what the goal is at the end, or at least hopefully most of us now at least know what that goal is. but she says it's really hard to explain to students that this is a valuable thing, and she doesn't go on to say really why or how.
Mhm.
But what I found super interesting that I've not seen anywhere in any note-taking literature, and it's because we've replaced it now, but she talks about her notes and the format and the structure, and literally a lot of her notes for various things are literally a paper version of a database.
Mhm.
So each note she's got is a row or a column in a database with certain values on it so that she can sort and resort it.
Mhm.
So she is a prefigure in the space of even things like punched cards and edge notched cards in
Mhm.
computer programming.
Cool.
But she's doing massive data analysis using notes, and she says, put one date and one day only on each card,
Right.
and then one topic heading and one. But essentially, she's giving you instructions on how to build a database as a sociologist for
really
doing like long-term historical research. And to my knowledge, no one's noticed this or even seen it in the kind of that bit of evolution of how do we take notes and maintain data and move that from an analog world into a digital world. And it is stunning to me. Now, the other thing too is she cites, and this is in 1926, so she cites 2 books on historical method from the late 1800s that both kind of take that same, they fall in the tradition of Conrad Gessner saying, take your notes, write one interesting, essentially atomic note on each card, and that's it. And then you can rearrange them and do whatever you want with them later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the names of the 2 guys, but she's saying that, so it's obviously it's common in that space, but she is a huge influential sociologist writing a year before Nicholas Luhmann is born in English. And she's referencing writers in both French and German who are like the roots of scientific historical method,
right?
Which to me is fascinating. Well, no. So here's the weird thing. She is for her time, incredibly radical. She would be, like Elizabeth Warren today, I think would be her rough equivalent. And I think where she made a mistake, both she and her husband believed a little too much of what was coming out of the Russian propaganda machine and didn't view it with as critical an eye as they might have, because the broad idea fit into their worldview, but they weren't keeping their eye on what is actually happening on the ground. Mm-hmm. And so they fell into that trap.
Right.
But broadly, I think the rest of their thought prior to that were separate from that is,
right.
We would all agree with, from a socialist perspective,
right,
or socialism perspective, without the,
I agree. I think she's sort of been on the edge of my radar for quite a long time. She and her husband Sidney, because like John Stuart Mill and like people sort of who are operating at that time, and she's a Fabian too, and the Fabians are also a group that I would like to sort of drill down into and understand much better. The thing that really fascinates me that I've been hearing just in the last, from you, Chris, and from other people in the last just couple of months really, is this connection to notes, which is just that's like just a whole nother really cool thing. She was also a baroness, apparently. So
yeah, so it's weird too. Her ultimate husband was a clerk. I think her paternal grandfather was an MP and had a power base, and her father was a fairly wealthy businessman with, I think she was the 8th of 9 daughters, which has got to be a hell of a household to grow up in.
Yeah.
And he was well learned, but she didn't, as far as I can tell, she didn't go to school and was self-taught,
Mhm.
but was in a circle that had a lot of value for education in general. So that certainly helped.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, I don't think she had any formal university education. But, you know, obviously kind of built something for herself. And I think from what I've been trying to dig into how she came across her note-taking practice and where it stemmed from. And I'm pretty sure it was something someone taught to her, rather than something she may have read and said, okay, this is the thing, let's do this.
Right.
But she inherited enough wealth from her father that when a couple years after she got married, her husband quit his clerk job and was able to devote himself to academia, essentially. And then in several years later, he was made a baron, and thus she a baroness, although I don't think, from what I can tell, they never asked or expected people to treat them with the deference of that title. It was kind of like, yeah, here's this thing we've got and it's lovely, but who cares? Like, call me Beatrice.
Yeah.
So her Wikipedia page, it's the thing at the top that the first thing you see and you're like, well, yes, but.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I had heard of her as, I wasn't aware that she had been made a baroness, or that Sydney had been ennobled. So yeah, so I mean, I was aware of them as sort of Fabians and, you know, and kind of social critics, and really, I think I had run across them in, I mean, almost that whole, you know, kind of tradition of like Henry Mayhew and Charles Booth and urban reform, you know, kind of writing. So yeah.
I haven't dug into it heavily, but apparently her paternal grandfather helped write essentially what was an English poor law in 1832, I think. So she did a huge amount of research into the effects of that and how it was implemented across England over 70 years, and then wrote essentially a report using her, I would say now it would be a statistical analysis or a database analysis based on her paper database notes. She was actually able to query it the way we would query a database to come up with answers for, was this a good thing or a bad thing? And essentially published in 1908 and 1910.
Yeah. And that's what Charles Booth had done a generation earlier, sort of going street by street in London and creating these maps of, the types of people and the types of conditions and things like that. Yeah, I think 1832 was the Reform Act. That's when the, quote unquote, the middle classes got the vote, but the middle class at that time was a very narrow band just beneath the aristocracy. But even so, I mean, it wasn't. And then in 1868, then the reform, the franchise.
That was an interesting little side journey, both on note taking and specifically on equality as it relates to what we've been talking about here, and Piketty's setup.
And so getting to Piketty's. So getting to Piketty's. One of the things that I was wondering, that I was thinking about as I was, I was kind of reading that, and I was kind of reading your response, Pat, especially, and your introduction of the Malcolm Nance kind of issue with, I mean, he's written so many books recently. It's almost like he's got a little. He's got his own little slip box that he's just crushing these things out of. But one of the things that occurred to me was, is all of this happening? Is all of this conversation that's being had at the end of the Piketty book happening? Sort of just at the moment when kind of the nation state as a historical organizing principle is becoming kind of less relevant.
Well, as I wonder that because I grew up when I was effectively somewhat aware of the world outside of knowing the shape of the map the world countries were, because there was always a world map of the country. I wonder that because of Brexit, the amount of crap and the straightforward xenophobia stuff that came from there, such that some of the top voices in it, Will Pickford Johnson sees he's going, hasn't gone yet. He's born in America. He's grown up mostly within Brussels and the gravy train. That is the European bureaucracy of aristocrats. One of the grandfathers covered, which one is actually a Turk, and one of his biggest lies from way back is Turkey will get EU membership against our will, and we'll be flooded with Turkish immigrants. Yet, in my lifetime, the EU went from like 7 to 14 to 20 to 27 or 28 members. And my direct experience of it in that context is half of the building sites I went to in the UK had all the safety regulations in English and Polish, because that's where the labour came from. But if I flip back to my latter adolescence, there's a comedy show. So this is now the say like 73 to 78. There's a comedy show in the UK about some bricklayers and builders and plumbers and chippies moving to Germany because we could, because what was the EU back then, and the UK construction industry is in a big slump. So the Labour moved. So the Labour moving saved the UK construction industry, particularly in the late 70s, just as I was joining it, as it happens. So all the British went to Germany making good money because they were being paid German rates, because Germans, being Germans, were very particular about the rules have to be followed. Right? And you've got this other idiot, as in Nigel Farage, who's made all his money from Europe, has a German wife, but has not, or at Brexit, had not yet got himself a German passport and German citizenship to carry on enjoying the benefits, but has done so since. Whereas almost everybody else can't do that. You can't spend the time, or you don't necessarily know it can be done, or whatever. And with the chapter 7 and 8, I think it is, we sort of looked at a bit of taxation stuff last time. But the next big 8, the big watch, isn't so much class, but what does class give you, particularly in education terms? And we're seeing with some of Piketty's data from France, he was talking about 100 to 300 times, or 100 to 300% money spent on those within the network versus those outside the network.
Yeah, that was interesting.
For their education. And I must admit, if you go back to, I think, 6 or 7, there was talk about the way that the formalisation of free for everybody mandatory education he talked about it being a fruition of the 1970s in the UK, but it was before that. My parents had mandatory education right up to the age of 15/16.
Mhm.
If you could show you were going to an educational apprenticeship, you were allowed to leave 1 year early, i.e. 15, because you would be going to the apprenticeship and some form of college type, whether it be inside the really big company or it would be an outside further education or higher education college, which was the layer that was underneath the polytechnics and so underneath the universities.
Right, but suggested that it really was to a great extent about vocational preparation.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it was. You were going to be an electrician or a plumber on the tools. It wasn't you were going to be a designer or an architect. I mean, that's the other thing is when I started in the construction industry, I was just on the cusp. When I got in, you could get in with what's known as an HND or an HNC, higher education certificate or higher education diploma, which is will often take you into the same subject to year 2 of a technical university or a polytechnic. And polytechnics did those qualifications as well. And would just roll, if you were really good, they would just roll you into the degree level course as you got your HNC, HND. And some of my compatriots, as in my day-to-day bosses, were not degree educated, but were corporate members of professional organizations. Now, if you look at particularly the American version of the professional engineer, not only do you need a degree, but you need a 4-year apprenticeship underneath another PE, professional engineer. Whereas I did all of that because I got lucky. I joined a really big firm. So big I didn't actually understand the structure of the industry. Other than you see the construction labels outside the building sites, and it's the same in the US. But a consultant designer back then was normally a pure designer. He tended not to do anything else. So he needs the smallest number of people. And for the first 2 or 3 years that I was designing, average size of a British environmental systems consultancy, i.e. water supply, air conditioning, lighting, heating, sewage, that type of stuff. So the things inside the building rather than the things that hold it up was 12, including the secretary. Yet the company I worked for had multiple offices, albeit most of the people worked in London or the London office. The London office employed 13 people full time in the library. But that's a 4,000 person company. I didn't recognise that when I joined, so I had complete freedom to say, oh, I'd like to try that. The next thing I know, next week is I've been shunted over to whatever that was. So I got my apprenticeship element very quickly and very easily. Most of my student friends, both at college and university, all struggled with it. And in some cases, I actually got them employment because it was easier for me to say, oh, by the way, HR, do we need a soil mechanic programmer this month? Yeah, let's have one of those. So the guy who was doing a soil mechanics PhD when he finished his degree, he had 2 years worth of work before he went back to his PhD. And the chapter 8 bit where he's going on about the ratios of the money, the discrimination, racial as well. It's he clearly knows a lot, and he's had a lot of help. and he's missed a couple, I think. And it's rather like you said, he has this faith in institutions that's a bit too far.
Mhm.
There's in the US, you've got your what's her name Parks sitting in the bus seat.
Yeah,
Sorry,
Rosa.
Alabama protest. Rosa Parks.
Yeah.
I can't remember what the guy's name is, but our equivalent was a bus driver because it's an employment thing. And as with many things, there's the divide and conquer process. So the bosses have always encouraged, where they had to, multiple unions so that no one union within the employment area dominates. And one of the places that really is visible is in the UK public transport, although there has been some amalgamation since the 70s. Back in the 60s, the bus drivers were one union, and the bus maintenance and ticket collectors and other people were all something else. And some of those were the general and transport workers versus the bus drivers. All these black people came over from Jamaica because we asked them to. This is the Windrush boat arrival. But there's plenty of stuff on Wikipedia for that got dumped by Theresa May a couple of years ago. All these Jamaican guys couldn't get a job driving a bus. They were allowed to drive a bus when it had broken down back to the depot because it wasn't being seen as a public service. But they wanted, obviously, the better class job, the better money, the better promotion stakes. In the end, they managed to get one of their Jamaican guys who spoke English British as opposed to Jamaican accent with a much more English name, like Clive Smith or something. I can't remember this. And if you look on the Bristol Bus Company protest, I think it is, in Wikipedia, you get the detail. They managed to get him through the first interview because they did it by telephone. And you couldn't tell over the telephone that you were talking to this black Jamaican skag smoking Rastafarian or whatever. And when he turned up, of course, he's just a black guy in very Western dress, white shirt, tie, jacket. You know, there would have been no problem other than he's black.
Mm-hmm.
But because he'd got through the first stage of the interview, it almost happened. But then the primarily white drivers, white male drivers union pushed back. And then it became a union versus union problem. And then, of course, therefore, the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, i.e. the Union of Unions, had to get involved. And I'm not quite sure what, if any, international follow-up. But in the end, they had to roll over. And so, and Bristol, partly because it was a big trading port, had, outside of London, I think, the biggest collection of Caribbean people in the UK at the time. Leicester area, Northants area, was where the Indians, Pakistani type, South Asians, as we now call them, had a big block. And of course, most of those are now Muslim as well. So a few years ago, I went back to my old school, which was Church of England. It was primarily white, probably 5 to 7% black, a few Italians and like one Indian brother and sister, a couple of Germans as well, and maybe a couple of French, but they're white, so you don't see them. And it's had to roll over. And even though it's a church, state, religious church school, so it's funded by the Church of England. And therefore, there is a church service there every day. If you want to go, you don't have to. there are the big services, 4 or 5 a year that everybody goes to regardless. I don't think we had a Jew there at all, to be honest. No Catholics either, because the Catholic school was up the road. It's now, by their school uniform dress, you could tell that a good proportion, 20-25%, are Muslim because they're going in with hijabs. And this is as north in London as you can get without going outside London. It's not really central. But I liked the way he'd got education level. Then you've got the RVs, disadvantaged people inside government, inside civil service, inside the boardroom. And the one that I had to really jerk at was the top 1,000 by the 0.1% at the rate, if the rate of trend from the data he had continued to get women to be 50% of the boards, it was going to take till 2047, 2147. So it's 120 years away at the current rate. And it's like, that's longer than 3/5 of a man count practically, you know. And does he really think that social inertia is that strong? And then you go, Henry, he's French. So let's look at all the French examples. And, you know, Les Moran, you know, the women carrying the flag over the barricades is the classic picture of the French Revolution. And yet, most of the data he's given us on that chapter is from French businesses and French government and French civil service, where women in the main haven't got to 20% yet.
Right.
In the top half. You know? So what happened there?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm looking at the I'm looking at a couple of questions in the chat too. The thing that I was referring to about the increasing relevance of businesses relative to states are things like, for example, Nafta and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? Which are these, are these kind of common. I mean, Nafta, we saw it sort of from a much different perspective than we saw TPP, for example. You know, Nafta, we were the biggest economy in Nafta. So there was Canada to our north, Mexico to our south. We created a common market. A lot of, and at the time, of the, I guess it was the 1990, the election that Bill Clinton was first elected in, when, people like, Ross Perot were saying, well, okay, if American workers are on average getting, $12 and Mexican workers are getting $1, and Mexican workers still the average wage is 55 cents an hour. It's gonna, at basic economics would suggest to you that, this is, that the U.S. wage is going to come down, the Mexican wage is going to come up, and it's going to, stabilize at $6 or whatever. And, so so that's great for the Mexicans, bad for the Americans. Right. And that's why that was, and his tagline in that campaign, I think, was the giant sucking sound. Right? That was going to be the economy of, the manufacturing economy of what was left in America at the end of the 1980s, kind of going, and they did, all of these jobs went to maquiladoras right across the border in border cities. And then the other thing that we didn't see was that it also created a a legal system, right, of investor trade in what they called, I think they called them investor trade courts. They were, and this became much more apparent in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? Because now all of a sudden, the idea of the investor trade court, and there's a similar thing. The EU has a similar thing, in Brussels or wherever, where businesses can bring suits against member nations. Right. And this didn't matter to us in NAFTA because we were the big dog. Right. But in TPP, we weren't necessarily going to be as much. And so, Southeast Asian and South Asian players in TPP were going to have the opportunity to sue in these investor courts if other people like us did something that was detrimental to their corporate interests, like pass labor legislation or safety legislation or environmental regulations, right? And so all of these regulations could be objected to in these courts that actually had authority, right? And corporations could seek redress in the form of either having the laws changed or getting some type of compensation for their losses. And so that was kind of one element that's one element where I would say that that the power of states is being eroded in favor of corporations. Another one would be the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
Can I jump in on that one real quick?
Go ahead.
So I guess a bit the point is it's been that way for a while, but maybe that's not the time scale Piketty's talking on. It's like a recent thing, like since I guess the 80s or 90s with NAFTA and WTO and stuff like that. And it's probably personally hard for me to picture it because I haven't been on the receiving end of that, because we've been the dominant actor in that, or companies in our nation state have been forcing their will on other lesser nation states, and they haven't so escaped that nation state relevance frame for them to be able to impose that back on the United States or other Western nations, I think is the point. Does that jive with you, Pat? Because you also asked, you wanted to have this clarified a bit, I think.
Well, I'm not sure where to respond to that question. Certainly, nations still remain the primary structure for organizing mankind. And the globalization has managed economically to override a lot of that. But I don't see nation states going away.
We got to have the police to enforce those rules from the corporations. So they just offload that to the states.
Well, and I guess I wouldn't completely disagree with you, Pat, but I guess my question is it where is the power actually? And and I guess you could if you wanted to take a cynical perspective, you can say, where was the power ever? At what point does that balance of power shift where things are not happening because of democracy, right? Because the people, because this is good for the people, and the people have decided that this is, in some type of a process, have decided that this is what they want to do. And I guess you could say, when has that been different? I think that one of the things that I kind of felt about Piketty was that he wants to blame a lot on Reagan and Thatcher. And so he sort of falls into that kind of.
Well, Reagan and Thatcher Reagan and Thatcher were just tools where the power is, and the power is with the wealth.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is, so you've got this, you've got this long period after the Great Depression, the New Deal in America, the Second World War, the Marshall Plan, all of this building up of Europe, and and kind of shifting from a wartime industrial policy in the United States to a peacetime consumerist industrial policy. All of these things, I think we probably need to kind of relook at the ways that we understand them and the stories that we tell about them. Go ahead, Tim.
Thanks. The corporate bit that I think we see easiest in the UK is pretty much, as you say, from the sort of Thatcher Reagan period onwards. It clearly seems that the 4/5 big owners of printing press get together and decide who should be the next Prime Minister. That's who we get. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has come out relatively recently, particularly in the slightly more left-leaning places that you might visit without washing your hands too often, have come up with the Brexit equivalent of corruption, of all of what was good about Jeremy Corbyn, for instance, as he is clearly the person that can beat the Tories, therefore he must not survive, full stop. And so the same as you get things like a 350 million a week Red Plus NHS cost in the EU, you get a similar stuff about him. And so we've now got effectively Tony Blair too as the Labour Party leader. And there's a Ford report, FORDE, that can come out this morning. Supposedly inspection.
I'm losing you. I can't hear you, Tim.
Sorry. There's the Ford report that came out this month. That is supposedly an independent audit of inspection of all the communications within the party mechanism for the Labour Party that shows how a small cartel within that has managed to circumvent all the rules and regulations and bring Jeremy down with the equivalent of the cigarette lobby that smoking doesn't cause cancer type techniques, etc., etc. And then, of course, if we now then turn it around and say, okay, who are these 5 or 6 people outside of the Daily Mail who we mentioned earlier? I think with the exception of the Guardian and the Independent, all of the what is now like 5, maybe 6 major papers physically exist outside as business from the UK, outside of its tax perspective. And yet they're allowed to have multi-thousand people operating companies that serve primarily Brits, mostly in the UK, but some of us obviously still living abroad at one point, or still across Europe in some cases. And when Maggie left and John Major took over and successfully beat back the equivalent of what Boris just went through in terms of the 1922 committee 3 or 4 times, and mostly over Europe and the integration deeper into Europe. the election was won because we were told that Labour was going to win anyway. It was such a big landslide. We went from like a 100-person majority one way to like a 200-person majority the other way. And on a sexist element, it was the election that had the biggest number of new women. They ended up with that sexist quote as it's Blair's babes. There was like 50 or 60 new women, all Labour, that got in on that election. And the reaction against was tiny. Rather like we've had precipitating Boris Johnson having to go, was all about all about lying about his deputy whip and his past and current behaviour. There was a guy called Martin Bell who accepted that he would stand in Tatton Park against the Tory there, who had been seen literally accepting brown paper bags full of cash so that he would go and ask a minister for time for his client, which is not supposed to happen, right? And yet had denied it, and was a Tory MP. And all the other parties said, okay, for that one constituency, we'll walk away. But only that one. It's only happened once. Right? The last couple of elections, there's been talk about local stroke regional agreements whereby they would share the work to get the Tories out, but it's never come to it. Until something as drastic as that, such that we end up with the equivalent of World War II union government, i.e. power sharing, rather than it's a Tory government or it's a Labour government, but nothing in between. And we actually then lose first past the post in some way with some form of proportional representation. You're never going to get out away from the fact that money buys votes, because money changes what the paper says, because the papers do what they're told in the moment.
Okay, so right, so that brings it back around to kind of what we're looking at in the end of this book and sort of Piketty's conclusion. So one of the things, but another of the things. So I think that there is that. There is his kind of reliance on that you've called attention to, his reliance on institutions and and kind of this worldview that he's living inside and writing from within. He goes off on a tangent though, or he opens up a new box when he starts talking about China, though. So what were people's reactions to his, kind of his take on how China plays in all of this? He said some things about real socialism versus this totalitarian thing in China. He says he has a chart on 231 that talks about the share of public property, which I have some thoughts about, but I want what do the rest of you think about this whole China situation?
It's not China specific, but I remember earlier in the book too, I think he suggested that communism in Russia in the early 1900s became a moving pressure on the West and particularly the United States that kind of pushed us to kind of a higher level of equality. And I'm not sure that he makes that same argument with respect to China now. But there's also kind of a confounding effect of, and it's weird too, because that push towards socialism and the Red Scare in America have created a large part of the older electorate in their now, the greatest generation, and then maybe the boomers thereafter, what's left of them, or the ones that are still around. And a lot of them are, because we're living longer generally.
Right.
And they're scared of socialism, and that's the boogeyman, versus a much younger group in the electorate now who have been the unwitting target of extreme capitalism, late stage capitalism, we might say, or I see more and more every day. And so they're being pushed towards more socialist tendencies, which we're seeing with effects of the far left, and even people like Ocasio-Cortez, at least in the U.S. So I'm curious about that China question now too, because that's the now modern day equivalent of who we are ostensibly fighting against, and even more so in a much more highly connected world, where a lot of our American manufacturing has been offshored to places like China.
Yeah, they make all of the stuff.
So how do you, and there's a huge backlash, at least in the US, of, America first and America only. And let's get rid of all these effects of, international trade, which, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face in some sense. But all these things bound up together, and then Russia's coming back now with issues in the international space that really compound all of these things together in one big mishmash.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious. I like the fact that we're reading a Frenchman's perspective, and he has a much more cosmopolitan view, and a view across history of multiple countries as it applies to colonialism and these kind of both short-term and long-term effects.
And yet, okay, so the Chinese make everything, right? And we're a little bit upset about that, and we'd like to do this America First thing, but we don't want to pay $2,000 for an iPhone, right? And we in 2017, 2018, the Chinese, the Taihu Lite supercomputer was the top supercomputer on the list, right? And that happened after the Obama administration started preventing the Chinese from buying Intel Xeon processors, right? So they were basing, so all of these supercomputers on the list, for the most part, were based on Intel Xeons, and we blocked them from buying processors. And then they said, well, okay, screw you, we'll go and we'll make our own. And so they built this Sunway processor that crushed the Intel processor. It had like 4 times the cores, had like 260 cores, and they owned the top of the list for, with that particular computer for a couple of years. So, so we tend to tell these stories about, that Huawei, right? The phone company, stealing, US technology, and that's not entirely true. And then Piketty tells this, he's on 231, right? He's got this, he's going on about this declining share of public property, right? And how, and he tells that, the top line, the red line is very visible, is in China, you went from, from the end of from the death of Mao, right? When the public sector owned, whatever that means, 70% of everything in China, down to the early 2000s when it got down to about 40%. And then he says, and then it stabilized, right? And then there was a kind of a counter revolution or whatever, and this shift towards towards capitalism, which I think it might even be wrong to kind of look at it that way, as capitalism versus communism. It stopped, and now it's kind of stabilized at yeah. That it stabilized at 40%, and then something's going on there. But at the bottom of that graph, of that chart, he's got the U.S. and Great Britain with negative share of public property, which is not a possibility, right? That it doesn't make any sense logically that the public sector can own negative 10% of all of the assets in America, right? And then when that, and so I looked at that and I thought, what's going on there, right? And so then in the parenthetical description, right, he says public assets net of debt, right, including all public collectivities, businesses, buildings, land, and financial holdings and assets. So in the United States, I mean, let's remember that the federal government owns 40% of the land west of the Mississippi, probably. Right. So how do we have negative 10% public ownership? Well, we do if
that land's all worthless, Dan.
it's all where, yeah, and the oil under it, and the coal under it, and the grass that people are grazing, cattle on it, So this is I guess this is a long-winded point, I guess, but there's this graph is crap, right? This is he's playing games with public debt, in a way that as I was looking at this and as I was thinking about this and preparing for this morning, I thought, I got to go back and reread Graeber's book on debt, right? Because one of the things that I recall from that is that Graeber at one point says, it doesn't make sense to think of the United States debt, of the money that the US theoretically owes to China, for example, as a debt, right? Because we're always saying, well, God, the US owes so much to China, they're gonna control us, they're all of that. And Graeber says maybe it's more reasonable to think of that as tribute that China has paid to us, rather than as money that they have loaned to us with the expectation of ever seeing it back again. So I think that Piketty's falling into some of these problematic assumptions. Go ahead, Justin.
Your point too, about the ownership of land west of the Mississippi is compounded in terms of our politics. Because I recall, I think in American Nations, Colin Woodard essentially makes the statement that most of kind of the Rockies around Colorado in particular, because the US government owns most of that land, and there's a lot of cattle farming, but there isn't other forms of farming or large manufacturing or other industries. It's all service industry contingent upon government ownership of pretty much all the land. So as a chunk of American society, all those people are heavily tied to where America is, where it's going, and what the laws are in terms of how their land and their space is being used, which is a whole nother kind of idea of debt and indebtedness that the people have, and it heavily influences how they vote and where they're going, because essentially their entire economy is contingent upon U.S. government policy of where their land is going and how it's being used.
Yeah.
And as a separate thing, and it's a crazy radical idea or out of the mainstream, but while we're thinking about colonialist effects in various societies, and I'm just going to throw it out there because I don't know what the second and third order knock-on effects are in relation to China and communism. But what if I said that the local small power group of China's Communist Party is a colonizing effect on its own country, which to some extent I think may, play out. So they're colonizing themselves first, and the spaces outside, and then growing from within. And then what happens then if they decide to move that colonizing effect beyond their own borders, which they're starting to do in parts of Africa, but they're doing it through economics and economic policy. But that's having kind of profound world socioeconomic effects on other countries as well, which we're now seeing because of the Russia-Ukraine situation.
Right. Well, it's weird too, because we have focused quite a bit on their, on the Uyghurs and and the Tibetans, and all of these internal peoples that they have not treated all that well. And we kind of completely forget our history of rolling across this continent, and displacing, native peoples in much worse ways. And then also, I think there's, I think it's a sci-fi show, The Expanse, right? There's a subplot in The Expanse that takes place on, I think it's in The Expanse, in the United Nations. The Chinese are trying to buy the Congo, aren't they? Is that not The Expanse? If it's not The Expanse, it's another sci-fi
Not
series.
in the TV show and not in the first book.
Okay. Well, there's another series that's been on recently that takes place in roughly, maybe a little bit closer to the present. And one of the big elements of the conflict early on is that China is trying to buy the Congo. Which I thought, well, that just kind of puts a, that sort of kind of puts it where it ought to be. One of the things, kind of radical, maybe last thoughts that I have about this is, I've been thinking, there's an old kind of cliche, right? That what you own owns you, right? So how do we reconcile that with the New World Order, right? Where, they keep saying is you will own nothing and be happy, right? So is there, because Levitt, the guy who built Levittown, right? One of his, that was early in the Cold War, right? And one of the things he said was, you can't be a communist if you own a house. Right. And so this was going to be a great force for capitalism and democracy, right? Home ownership for everybody. Everybody has a stake. What happens now?
Not a lot of people know it, but one of the biggest Levitt towns built after some of his in the Northeast was in Puerto Rico in the 50s. And it did not have the same positive effect there that it did in the US.
That's a good point.
And I've only seen one or two references to it ever, but that somehow and it become then even more so because that was a much more colonizing effect there at that time.
Sure. Yeah.
Than it was as an internal, and I'm sure it was heavily compounded by politics within Cuba, particularly at that point.
Yeah. Well, and that's a kind of leads to that interesting speculation about, how much is, the building of Levitt towns and, and suburban development, internal colonialism. And,
Well, and even modern politics, because I remember I had TV news on 4 channels in front of me with 57 TVs. So I remember in the 90s, Bill O'Reilly very specifically mentioned frequently that he grew up in the original Levitt town, or one of the original Levitt towns, and that heavily influenced his worldview.
Sure.
Which then became the worldview of Fox News and to a great extent.
Well, and Levittown, the original Levittowns, the original couple of them did have racial covenants too. So just saying. And, so yeah, it's interesting. I don't know.
And if you think about it, that kind of power structure, literally, a lot of those Levitt towns were also built on immigrant communities of Irish, Italian, Scots spaces. So in some sense, that was the colonialist influence on those people who were then indigenous to that new space.
Mm-hmm.
So it was part of the assimilation of, corporate America taking over an immigrant population that had its own identity at the time that then assimilated that same population.
Right. Yeah. Or regional differences. I mean, the whole homogenization of regional differences, the sort of McDonald's, effect, and the moving from, from this place where, I mean, that was the thing that you always heard about, driving Route 66, right? Was that you saw America, but it was a different America, 10 miles down the road or 100 miles down the road or whatever, and then what we got later was, this sort of retreat into this safety of knowing, wherever I go, I'm going to be able to get a burger, right? And that somehow that became kind of a value. There was almost a, I don't know. Yeah. So we're kind of at 90 minutes. I wanted to also kind of discuss where we go from here. And my thought was August is going to be pretty busy for me. So I would like to take a few weeks off. But then I would be happy to continue meeting and talking both about sort of notes and knowledge management, and also a book. I am kind of thinking that I want to return to read something like Debt, the First 5,000 Years again sometime soon. We could also read something like this web book. If it's, I mean, if there are some things that are more focused towards, so kind of the knowledge management, the PKM side or the note-taking side, we did kind of briefly talk about building a second brain. I'm not sure that is something that I would want to spend weeks on, kind of digging down into where's the fragility? Are we, Tim, is that a Taleb reference, or where's the what fragility in what context?
Oh, you were working remotely with your Substack newsletter.
Oh.
And you had a different blue t-shirt on. On the photograph, not because there's no video for that.
I'm yeah, I actually tried making a video in this coffee shop that I was in the I tried to make that one where I said I was working remotely was supposed to be a script for a video, and then I recorded it, and there was just way too much background noise. So that didn't work out. Yeah, so I've been away. I need to kind of get back to doing things. I would like to look at debt again. I know that we've been, we've leaned into, quite a bit into Graeber.
There's an element of I think your working remotely has element of the earlier question about time blocking, because obviously you can time block a regular week, or you can time block an exceptional time away
Right.
for the week. So I don't have my bookshelf to hand.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Except in that context, I do, because the 40,000 odd volumes on my laptop.
Yeah, that was why I was able to get this thing that I was writing done. I think was that I was remote. Yeah. So I would go. Okay, so we've got a couple of potential positive statements in the chat about debt. We can, we don't have to decide right now either. So maybe I will.
Another idea I had seen that went by recently was a book called Horizons by Hoskett, which is kind of a history of revisiting the history of the big scientific ideas that were all, Newton came up with his ideas all by himself, and this author proposes that, well, no, there was a big flow of ideas, and kind of revisiting that for a whole bunch of different things.
Oh, okay. That would kind of play into the kind of how does knowledge work?
Yeah, that's the angle I saw there for that.
Yeah.
It was like, how do ideas actually generate?
The global origins of modern science, Poskett.
Yeah,
That could be cool.
I don't think about it. I'm not 100% committed to reading that myself yet, but it sounded interesting. So
okay, so that I'll circle that as a possibility. Cool. Yeah, that does look interesting. Yeah, because I've and maybe we could read something like that synoptically with something like Vaclav Smil, who is a historian kind of technology, but he is kind he celebrates technology, right, in history, and he's written a bunch of books. I think he worked at a Canadian university. And he's got one called Grand Transitions: How the Modern World Was Made. And in the past, I have found some of the stuff that he's written to be a little bit reductive, right? But it might be an interesting thing to compare with this other view, if what Poskett does is kind of opens up a sort of a critique of that sort of triumphalism. Yeah, energy, the numbers, how the world really works. He's come up with recently. The numbers don't lie. He's got one, energy and civilization, grand transitions, growth. I've
looked at Smil books in the past and have never quite been sold on actually committing to read one. But I'd be, if there was a cohort that was going to give it a try, I would give it a try.
Sure.
I'm curious how you came to Smil's work in the first place, Dan.
environmental history. There was a book called Creating, I think he wrote two books. One of them was sort of like creating the 19th century, and the other one was creating the 20th century. And he was, and the guy who was my field advisor for global environmental history, guy named Ted Malillo at Amherst College, suggested that it was on his shelf, and he said, he's not perfect, but and then I found, and then I think I was more critical of Smill than Ted was. The ways that he sort of the ways that he sort of celebrates the internal combustion engine and all of it. I mean, it's very, it's triumphalist. It kind of leans into this idea that these things were inevitable, and that couldn't have happened any differently. And yet, I will say, tons and tons of useful facts, right, and information that was very valuable to me, and that was very kind of important that I understood. So, yeah, I just didn't agree with all his,
I figured you came at it more from that history and environmental space, but he is much better known to the rest of the populace because Bill Gates says he's cool.
Yes,
Bill Gates. Literally 90% of his readership is because Bill Gates said, "Hey, he's on my top 10 list, and this is the guy to follow." So
that's true. That's true, and his publishing, he has exploded since then. Shorter things, less rigorous, less scholarly things to kind of lean into that. I think he was also the guy who really identified the importance of the Haber-Bosch nitrogen fixation process in global environmental history, right? And this idea that that at least 2 billion of the people who are alive today would not be had the Haber-Bosch process not been invented. And I think again that's probably overstating it a little bit. There were other nitrogen fixation processes, but
another thing that strikes me as fitting into some of the broader themes we've looked at, the environmentalism piece, the equity and equality stuff, the history, but Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass may be something that many of us may have some interest in, but may not have read, and be kind of a broad, interesting perspective that we haven't had, but that ties into kind of Graeber and Wengrow and indigenous peoples.
Right. Yeah, and that might actually pull back in some people who have sort of dropped away along the last couple of months. Who did? Yeah, there were several people who seemed interested in that when it came up when we were first talking about the dawn of everything. Who might be? Yeah, maybe I'll put up a poll and send it to everybody who's ever been involved and see what types of reactions.
Or put out don't put out a poll first. Put out a call for ideas.
Yeah. Okay.
And then put out the poll.
Right. Good point. Yep. So braiding sweetgrass. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Then, just to tie things together between now and then, if we take a break off and you wanted to put in a week somewhere of a discussion of, Tiago Forte.
Oh yeah, just like a 1 week. Yeah, everybody come.
I agree with you. I don't think it's worth. Most of us, I think, are above and beyond where he's at and what he's talking about. But it might make an interesting critique of people who have a practice like this reacting to someone who's saying, in some sense, here's the way. Try this.
Yeah. Yeah. My initial reaction to what Tiago did was that it was way too heavy on anecdotes and not enough details of practice. But
Yeah, I mean, he does give at least some other examples, although my opinion is they're all too heavily put on kind of the United States entertainment enterprise. So everybody he gives as an example is a creative person in music or film or television or dance.
mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
and he doesn't. So, and for someone who is focused on a more kind of corporate productivity as his bread and butter, like holding that up as the
Mhm.
example, you know, I'd rather have examples of people, you know, doing day jobs at IBM.
Yeah.
How are they brilliant? You know, give me
Yeah.
those examples.
Right.
Like
Yeah. Or
that's your bread and butter space. Where are those examples?
right. Right. Okay. Okay. Cool.
And I've got one suggestion.
Yeah.
Sorry. What was it? I have to go back. It's a vindication of the rights of women by Mary Wollstonecraft.
Wollstonecraft. Yeah.
Yeah, because we're talking about equality and
Mhm.
with Piketty,
Yeah.
and so that might be because that's like one of the founding documents of modern feminism.
It is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So vindication of the rights of women.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Which could open. Yeah. Which could open a whole interesting. Because that, you know, Wollstonecraft and Webb kind of fit together,
Mhm.
you know, and that's an interesting, that's an interesting period. Yeah, maybe we could contextualize that with something that's more.
And as a side note, I've actually been to Mary Wollstonecraft's church and sat in her pew at
Oh,
Master
wow.
Teddy's service.
Fabulous. Well, you know, and it's kind of that's kind of that whole period of, you know, kind of that. I mean, it begins as sort of classical liberalism, and then, you know, and then sort of evolves into, you know, a vindication of the rights of women, and then
Mhm.
late.
Yeah, so,
I mean, it's sort of late Enlightenment.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that, you know, and one of the things, as we were talking about Webb, Wollstonecraft kind of fits there. Also in America, you know, Jane Addams, you know, and even Helen Keller, I mean, became a huge radical, right, in her later years. I mean, she became this activist who went around and so wow.
I'll suggest another idea that may be interesting to folks, but it will depend on how quickly it's done. But I heard there's a cool academic in Minnesota writing a book about note-taking and like scholarly stuff. And I think if we were nice about it, he might release an early copy that we could all read and make notes on in an attempt to maybe expand or improve or help out the endeavor. I don't know if anybody knows him. He would have to like bend his arm to get him to do that.
Then we could be his peer review.
You could actually. I could. I mean, that would be something that I would want to limit, you know, like Tiago's, to, you know, maybe let's talk about it once sort of thing. It's I mean, and it's going to be, as I was doing this, as I was doing it, I was thinking, well, how much do I want to take on? You know, who do I want to, you know, who is my actual audience? And I decided, so this may not interest you as much, really, you know, Chris and everybody else. I decided that really my core audience is still kind of students. And and so it does. Yeah, you're a student. Yeah. Yes. So I, but yeah. Okay.
I just threw it out there as an idea because you probably would. And if you would benefit from it, then do it. And if not, then.
All right. Yeah, maybe I will, I'll kind of propose that as a one-off. Yeah, thank you. So, okay.
No, we might be too mean too. Who knows?
We might just say, this is just crap, and don't bother. Just don't ever press the publish button, which actually would be better to know before rather than after. So, okay. And then I'm seeing some other territories of science and religion I am not familiar with, but that could be cool.
I know there's a relatively new David Christian book out, but even something in the broad, like
big history kind of thing.
History space.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also something that I've been very interested in. I've listened to a little bit of it, haven't gotten through. There's a really cool new book. I don't know how new it is, by a guy talking about, and it kind of is a little bit adjacent to Graeber and Wengrow. Where is it? The other thing was there's all of that kind of other adjacent stuff, like the who we are and how we got here. Ancient DNA and the New Science of the Human Past, David Reich. And which really kind of talked a lot about really recent. It was written in 2018. Really, really recent paleogenetic stuff that kind of puts to bed a lot of the myths of migrations, and actually kind of validates some of the the linguistic stuff that the previous generations had done, Indo-European language group kind of stuff, in interesting and not entirely expected ways. So I've been kind of looking forward to sort of that as well. And there's other things, Stoicism, the War of Art. I've been planning to read sometime, Stephen Pressfield.
So basically, we're just going through your to read list.
I don't. Yes. So that's probably we're getting to diminishing returns, right?
I've read The War of Art. I found it meh. So.
Okay. All right.
On the Peter Harrison thing, it's interesting because the thesis of the book is that we judge everything prior to modernity through the lens of modernity, and we don't understand that the medievals and the ancients and so forth had an extremely different worldview. And he basically shows that that science and religion, as we understand them, were invented 300-400 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it really opens up a whole new sort of can of worms. It's like, wow, we really are. And he folds in the Reformation and all that, how that shaped, and it's really interesting.
Would that be something that it would make sense to read synoptically with something like Braiding Sweetgrass?
Don't know that one.
That would be one of those ones where I mean, we tried this before with the two that we picked that sounded like they were adjacent, but turned out not to be as much as I had hoped.
What's the Sweetgrass?
Do you want to synopsize that quickly, Chris?
So it's an an indigenous woman who grew up in, I want to say she's in the New England area, is an indigenous Indian. The writing was stupendously great. She really is a poet as much as anything, but she reframes as a professional biologist who grew up with both Western culture and an indigenous Indian culture. She kind of looks at the modern world and how we all approach it, and essentially just reframes, you know, their traditional Western narrative to something that impinges on equality and or greater equality and environmentalism, and how you could look at things differently. So it's the perspective that you might have gotten from the indigenous peoples that Graver and Waingro are talking about, but you actually get it in that voice, and from someone who has feet in both sides of that world.
Yeah, that might jive. It seems like her point of view might take a little bit of a different angle, but both of them are reframing modernity, certainly.
Rethinking, Science Without God, rethinking the history of scientific naturalism is what you were talking about. Interesting. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that could be fun. Cool. Yeah, I found that at, I'll put the, not that everybody needs to follow Amazon links, but.
Kind of like the fact that we read, and even though it was in translation, something from, you know, it still was a Western viewpoint, but having read at least a Frenchman's version of things. So if anybody can think of things outside of the usual scope of even Western thought, that to me, that would be kind of cool. Or at least diversify the types of things we're reading. To me, that, you know, that was it was a short magazine type article section of her book that I read, but seeing Beatrice Webb's perspective from 1926 on a topic that I'm intimately interested in now was fascinating. And, you know, seeing those pieces of history were super interesting.
But it's the old translator's issue, isn't it? If you take, say, even something as simple and as close to English as classic German, and telling the time, it's 3 o'clock, it's 3:15, it's 4:45, it's 4 o'clock. And the one in the middle, we all know as 3:30, but classic German is half before 4. So is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? But all you Americans think it's 2nd of January. But and you go further, you go all the way over to Mandarin. We think forward as in front of me is the future, and behind is the past. But Mandarin, the time scale is up, down, and the past is below, under your feet. The future is above your head. And that's current, that's now. There's no, although it's an old language, it's now. It's not as though we're having to read the Rosetta Stone 3 languages apart to get to there. That's now. So why do we ever think, hence I think somebody come up with that meme about horseplay versus pony play. You know, at a quick reading, they could be materially the same. They're just not. You know? So yeah, I mean, I must admit the over and above the things like the Three Sisters for the Native Americans type stuff that I knew from, I can't remember when, certainly before I read D. Brown's I Left My Heart at Wounded Knee, for instance, and had Soldier Blue, for instance, as the movie to watch, as this is what really happened. It's not John Wayne, even in The Surgeons type thing.
Mhm.
It's genocide,
Yeah.
as opposed to anything else. And it's like, so if we roll it back, and obviously, particularly being working here, as I may have said before, every now and then, half my workforce, which was basically South Asian, as in Indian, Pakistani, Sri Lankan, there would be a racial issue comes up, but it would be Indian to Indian or Indian to Pakistan. And some of the time, that would come up to me at my level and I'd have to go sort it out. Sometimes they'd always complain, oh, you English, you always side with the whichever village got the pass, as it were. And my normal response to that is, of course, yes, but I'm not English. And my grandfather was beaten at school for speaking native language.
Mm.
And that's only the 1920s. You know, in Wales, in South Wales, in a Welsh mining town, you're beaten for speaking English in the Welsh in the playground.
Mm.
You know, now,
Yeah, we sort of forget in America. We forget that the British tested out everything that they did overseas on the Welsh and the Scots and the Irish first.
Yes, at that point, of course, you can't say the British because you mean he's
The
the
English. Yeah, the English.
But by the time they'd worked it out, or partially on the Welsh, they're not even English. You know, are they Mercian or are they Wessex?
Yeah.
You know, is it King Alfred before England? And then England at that point is really only sort of south of Brum. The rest of it is Danelaw or Northumbria as a, inverted commas, Anglo-Saxon outlier, etc. And it's but go back to language.
Yeah.
Why'd you get off scot-free? It's nothing to do with Scots, or even the Irish. It's the old Norse word for being forgiven a tax. You get let go a tax, you get off scot-free.
Oh.
And yet it's the same word. You know?
Oh.
And then of course we wonder why some people have problems learning English.
Yeah.
When they already speak Arabic, French, and 3 other languages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of. So what I'll do is I will look through all of these titles that people have posted. I was just looking. I was scrolling through the Ong. It seems like it's got a lot in it. Maybe there are. Maybe people have favorite chapters in some of these things that it might, that we might put up against, against other chapters from other.
And before we go too far down this road, how is everybody off for vacation time? Do we want to actually take a week or 2 off sometime?
Yeah.
Or are we just going to keep rolling?
I'm thinking if people are interested, I was thinking of maybe taking Chris's offer seriously and saying that that maybe next week I would turn on Zoom and see if anybody wants to come and talk about the thing that I'm planning on putting out in the world, and then taking a couple weeks off, taking the better part of August off, and actually now let me just think about having just said that today's the 23rd. Yeah, I could meet again on the 30th. Then I've got to go to Pittsburgh and help my daughter get married. And that'll take a week. And then, and then I'll be getting ready for school to begin. So I would like to take, maybe 3 weeks, the first 3 weeks of August off, and kind of convene again towards the 27th of August. Would that work for people?
And if we pick something sooner than later,
Yes.
then people can kind of start reading and thinking.
Right. Get hold of books if we're going to get them from libraries and start.
So what's happening next week?
So next week I will put out a. I'll give you a link to my little manuscript. And we'll talk about that if you're interested. And then
unpaid editing.
What's that?
Unpaid editing review.
Yeah. Yes, and so don't feel like doing any. Yeah, so don't do any more than you feel like doing.
Actually, that actually suits me quite nicely because alternate weeks earlier than this is my writer's crit session, and the lead for that has recent family deaths, so they've all gone back to the UK, and it's just too much to organise from there, even though we're doing it by Zoom. So I have nobody else's work to use my red pen with. So
okay,
you're in luck.
All right, I am a little bit nervous about that, but we'll see how it goes.
But just remember, English. There is only British English. Everything else is a mistake, right?
Well, I do use the Oxford comma, but I don't. Beyond that,
and you'll have plenty of U's in the Thai spelling, right?
No, yeah. So I don't use the U, but I do try not to end my sentences with prepositions. So that and I think of that as being British too.
Or in conversation, the spaces between words replaced with the word like.
Yeah, or which is sort of my go-to, which I need to put a shock collar on myself or something.
Oh yeah, don't you know?
Yeah, you bet.
Oh dear.
So an Octavia Butler shock collar.
Yeah. Okay. And on that note, we should probably close. Go ahead, Tor.
Just letting you know, my Open University module website's open in middle of September. So for the few weeks, those few weeks, I'll be trying to get back into the swing of things with that. So I'm not too sure if I'll be able to attend every session during the early part of the September, October. Okay. So as I get used to the subject matter and whatnot.
Well, and if we're gonna read two things, we'll try to pick a pace that is more appropriate than the last time we did that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I've got two modules.
Dan, what form are you going to put your thing out in?
It is currently I'm putting it out in a Pressbooks ebook.
No, I mean when you send the link to us.
I think what I'll do is I'll just hit the publish button on that and not tell anybody else. Was my first thought, rather than sending you a long Word document or something like that, so that you'd kind of see what it will end up looking like.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So I will, and I'll be, like I said, I'll be kind of tweaking that this afternoon. And then I'll send you a link, or I'll put it in. Actually, what I'll do is I'll put it in the community forum.
Yeah, sound good.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. Time flew, but
Ciao, everyone.
It was fun. All right. So, so see you soon.
Yep.
We appreciate it, Dan. Thanks.
Ciao.
Yeah.